Hi, everybody. This is Steve Maggi from SMA Law Firm. I'm here with Jacob Willemsen from Transatlantic Business Services. Thanks for being with us, Jacob, and welcome to Building the Bridge.
Happy to be here.
So we work a lot with foreign entities, and some of them start doing business in the US. They're putting their feelers out there. They're starting to move things, maybe get some recognition. What's that tipping point moment where they really should consider incorporating in the US?
I'm happy that you asked, because what we see nowadays with the trend of e-commerce is that a lot of companies feel like they can safely do business from outside the United States, serving their U.S. clients, and that can actually be more dangerous than they think, and they can actually have legal and tax presence in the U.S. already without actually knowing it. So what we see is, especially if you work with agents or with employees, or you deliver SIF with service contracts and things like that, you should be aware, and it may actually be better to set up a U.S. entity already, where you isolate those risks
Right.
rather than unknowingly exposing your European entity or Latin American entity with all the assets, the IP and everything, to US taxes and US legal presence. This actually became much more apparent with the sales tax, right? A lot of American companies are now competing with foreign entities that don't have to charge sales tax, or at least they think that they don't have to charge sales tax.
Right.
You can be sure that American states, the individual states, are aggressively going after these kinds of competitors, because not only does the state miss out on sales tax revenue, it also competes unfairly, I have to admit, with the local SMEs in the United States who do have to charge sales tax. So it's something that's on the radar, and companies should not think that they can just hide behind the border and get the maximum opportunities as well, the maximum out of the potential of the US by doing that remotely from abroad.
I've talked to IP attorneys, and they always talk about presence. When the presence of a foreign entity or a foreign business is felt in the US is when they need to start protecting their intellectual property. And that also happens here, right? There's a certain point where you can't hide the fact that you're doing business in the US through your foreign entity. And that's when those states will be coming after you, right?
Yeah, and they're very easy giveaways. I sometimes have to laugh about clients using a US flag or US shipping terms, US return conditions. And like, well, if you use that kind of language on your website, you're basically giving the U.S. jurisdictions already a heads up that you admit that you're doing business in the U.S. How can you claim that you were not doing business in the U.S. and that you were doing all this business from abroad if you actually adapted your whole website to serving U.S. clients?
Absolutely. And there's another thing that we haven't talked about yet, but we've seen it together with the clients we've worked with, is that there's also a huge advantage to having a US entity in terms of the reachability of your company, how people take you, if they take you seriously or not, if they perceive you as local, that there are advantages to doing business with you as opposed to being a foreign entity too, right?
Yeah, and we've seen that surprised the entities themselves. In the past, there's been a trend towards setting up a U.S. entity, also because of the tax reforms. The tax rates in the U.S. have decreased substantially over the last years, which meant that foreign entities were not as reluctant to leave presence and thus profits in the U.S. And what they were surprised of and admitted themselves in the surveys that we did amongst, I would say, 225 companies, was that, yes, they felt like they were forced to put more presence in the US, either for immigration purposes or for tax purposes. But at the same time, they realized that actually had a much more positive impact on their business potential than they realized, than they had previously thought. The US customer, whether it's a B2B or a B2C transaction, much more likely will do business with you if you have a US entity than when you're a foreign entity.
Because you have really the advantage of being perceived as a local company, but also have the track record of the foreign entity to back you up, which gives you a lot more cachet when you're trying to court potential clients or customers, right?
Yeah, you're right. And in addition, there is additional administrative reason or the tasks for a U.S. entity to do transactions with a foreign entity. That comes with certain responsibilities, which go into money laundering and maybe also some terrorism financing. So US companies, since they don't want to have to justify why they send money to a certain foreign entity, if they have an option to do business with a US entity under the same condition, you will have an uphill battle. They will come to you as a last resort unless they have a US option for that.
Or that's really what makes the decision final, right, between one entity and the other.
Yeah, it can be a very small difference. And let's face it, in that way, I think typical US businesses are risk averse. Securities in the US are not as good for your job. So you don't want to get caught on making errors. You rather perhaps spend a little bit more money and making sure that you do business with a company that has been vetted and is working under the US law rather than under a foreign law.
So if you're an entity that's starting to dip your toes in the water in the US market, and you're wondering about when is that tipping point, when should I start moving forward with incorporation and setting up my US entity, how do you get in touch? How do they get in touch with you, Jacob?
Yeah, we can always have a brief conversation. We'll go through a couple of checkboxes, and we'll be very clear that if you really first want to see whether there's traction for your product or services, that you at least make sure that you don't unknowingly create that presence. But also the other way around, if you feel like the US has proven itself to be a very or a potential market, that you then set up your US entity rather sooner than later, and that you limit the time that you do business with your foreign entity in the US. It's fine to test the market, but then you should also kind of make the decision at some point to make the move and start a US entity. And they can always contact us through bizdev@tapsinc.com and set up a meeting, and we'll always be happy to talk to them.
Sounds great. Thanks for your time and your knowledge today, Jacob.
You're welcome. Take care.